You're listening to Silent Crime Stories. Tonight, we step into the shadows once more, into a story that someone somewhere tried to keep buried. Pull up a chair, turn off the lights, and listen closely, because every detail matters. October came early that year. By the first days of the month, the oak trees along the James River had already gone yellow, faster than they should have, as though the trees had rushed their dying, wanting to be done before the first hard frost. The dirt roads between farms in Daviess County had baked into cracked, brown slabs. The air smelled of silage and dry grass and that sharp, faintly metallic scent that settles over Missouri every fall when the sun comes up late and sets too soon. Farmers were finishing with the corn. Men rode tractors across stripped fields. Women sealed mason jars in hot kitchens. Dogs stretched out on porch boards and watched the fields with eyes that held nothing at all. The Copeland place sat a few miles south of Mooresville, off a state road intersection where nobody stopped unless they had business. It was an old farm, white house with peeling paint, red barn listing slightly east as if it had been meaning to fall for years and only habit kept it upright. Fields all around, woods beyond the fields. Beyond the woods, the kind of silence that in this part of Missouri just means things are as they should be. Everything in its place, everyone minding their own. The neighbors knew the Copelands kept to themselves. Old Ray wasn't a man for fence line conversation. Faye almost never came out. Every so often some new hired hand would show up at the farm, a stranger, somebody passing through. Work a few weeks and then move on. That's how people explained it. He moved on. Men like that always move on. Nobody asked where. For years, that silence, that absence of questions, was enough. Because in Daviess County, autumn smelled the same as it always had. The houses had the same porches. The earth held what had been put into it. That's what people believed. The earth was holding more than anyone wanted to know. Then one cool October morning, when fog still lay flat across the pastures, a man walked into the Daviess County Sheriff's office and said things that couldn't easily be said. And that quiet, that order, that normalcy, those figures who had gone without a trace, began to come apart like old paint off a tired house. Ray Copeland was born in 1914 in Arkansas, into a family with too little land, too little money, and too many children. It's easy to romanticize poverty from that era and place. To picture the poor but honest, hard-working people of deep America who weathered the Depression with dignity and grit. Ray Copeland was something else. From early on, he displayed what might be called, carefully but accurately, a cold, instrumental relationship with the truth. Lying wasn't desperation for him. It was a tool. It was how he moved through the world. His first serious brush with the law came as a teenager. Document fraud in a business deal. No prison time, but the case left a mark in the county court record and, more importantly, in his own thinking. He didn't conclude that dishonesty was wrong. He concluded that he'd made a technical mistake that got him caught. Over the following decades, he ran the same plays: cattle fraud, bad checks, small-time swindles. And every arrest or fine was a lesson in craft, not conscience. He kept moving. Arkansas to Oklahoma, Oklahoma to Nebraska, Nebraska to Missouri. Always toward some place where nobody knew his name yet. Always with the same intentions. He was a short, hard man, with large hands and not much to say. Farmers who knew him called him secretive. Women who dealt with him in a professional capacity called him cold. Men who tried to do business with him just said he was a tough trader. Nobody said dangerous. That word only surfaces in retrospect, once you know what to look for. He met Faye Wilson sometime in the 1940s, though the exact timeline of their relationship is difficult to pin down. Both of them kept quiet about the past, and that silence may have been the first thing they had in common. Faye was calm, disciplined, a woman whose face in old photographs registers mainly exhaustion, not sadness, not bitterness, but the particular weariness that comes from years of living under someone else's rules. They married and settled into farm life that, from the road, looked like every other farm life in that part of Missouri. Hard, repetitive, governed by seasons and commodity prices. They had children. They paid their bills. They went to church, at least for a while. The land was theirs, and they worked it the way it needed to be worked. Or that's how it appeared from the outside. But Ray Copeland couldn't function without the pattern he'd always known. That gap between the official story and the real one. That small pocket of deception where he felt more at home than anywhere else. And with each passing year, with each new transaction pushed just past the legal line, with each narrow escape, that gap grew wider. The scheme Ray Copeland put together in the late 1980s was, at its core, simple. The complexity wasn't in the structure. It was in the execution, in the precision with which he selected his tools. And in this case, the tools were people. He looked for men without roots, homeless men, seasonal laborers, veterans with problems, ex-cons, men who moved through middle America like debris in a slow river. No fixed address, no family checking on them, no credit history, but a social security number. That last part was the key. He needed someone who could open a bank account, someone who could sign a check, a legal check, on a real account with a real name. The scheme worked like this. Copeland would buy cattle from local farmers, paying with checks written by his hired hands. The checks drew on accounts the men had opened at his direction. Accounts with no money in them, accounts created for the sole purpose of existing briefly and then disappearing. The sellers accepted the checks in good faith. They knew Copeland. They knew his farm. By the time the check came back marked insufficient funds, Ray had already sold the cattle and pocketed the cash. The farmer took the loss. The hired hand and the account vanished. Vanished. That word again. For years, Missouri law enforcement logged complaints against Copeland. Bad checks, fraudulent transactions, forged documents. He was called in for questioning. He paid fines. He promised to do better. He had a reputation as a dishonest dealer, someone you didn't do business with if you knew better. But a dishonest cattle trader isn't a murderer. Nobody connected those two things. To connect them, you would have had to know that the hired hands weren't moving on, that they weren't finding work in another state, that they were staying. They stayed beneath the barn floor, in an old well, in the ground, which had learned to keep quiet a long time ago. The men who ended up at the Copeland farm were different from each other in the details and almost identical in the essentials. What they shared was this: the system couldn't see them. They weren't on voter rolls. They had no permanent address. Their names didn't appear in subscription lists, customer databases, or social registries. They existed in America, but somehow outside it. In that gray space where a person is real only as long as someone remembers him, and when no one does, it's as if he never was. Ray Copeland knew where to find them. Homeless shelters in Kansas City and Springfield, rooming houses near the bus depot, bars along Route 36 where men without plans sat at the counter and stared into their beer like the answer might be at the bottom. He came with an offer: work on the farm, a roof, meals, a little cash each week. Simple terms. No questions about the past. No questions about the past. That was the part that landed. Men with complicated histories value people who don't ask. They arrived in Mooresville by state bus or hitchhike. They got off at the intersection and walked down that hard autumn road toward the White House and the Red Barn. Copeland was waiting. He was polite within the limits of his nature. Not warm, not hostile. Functional. He showed them what needed doing. Feed the cattle, fix the fences, muck out the barn. They worked. They ate at the table. They slept in the barn or in a small room off the garage. And then, after a few weeks or a month, Copeland would come to the hired hand with a proposition. He wanted them to go to the bank, open an account, write a few checks. He explained it was complicated, taxes, bookkeeping, and that this was just easier. Men who have a roof and a hot meal aren't inclined to push back on complicated tax explanations. They signed. Not all of them. Some picked up on something wrong. Something in the tone of his voice, in the length of his silences, in the way his gaze measured a man like he was calculating a price. Those men left early, Those men lived. The ones who stayed are spoken of by name now, because the truth about a person is that he only truly enters the record when he dies. Jack Wayne Freeman, Paul Jason Cowart, John Harold Freeman, Jimmy Dale Harvey, Wayne Robert Warner. 5 names, 5 social security numbers, 5 sets of fingerprints sitting in state archives that had no reason to talk to each other. 5 men nobody was looking for, because nobody knew to look. Once the check was signed, once the cattle were sold, each of these men became a problem. A specific cold kind of problem. He knew too much. He could walk into a police station. He could put a name to the scheme. Ray Copeland had spent decades building something, and he wasn't going to let one drifting stranger unravel it. Ray Copeland shot them in the back of the head. He used a hunting rifle. There was no ceremony to it. It was a practical act, the elimination of a problem, the same way you put down sick livestock or cut out rot before it spreads. He buried the bodies on the property, beneath the barn floor in the old well, in the ground surrounding that white house with the peeling paint. And the earth kept the secret the way it keeps everything, quietly, indifferently, without comment. Faye Copeland knew. That sentence, short, plain, and devastating, contains the full complexity of a case that would occupy judges, juries, and psychologists for years. She knew. But what exactly she knew, what she witnessed, what she was told, and what she only suspected, that question was never fully resolved. Throughout the investigation and the trial, Faye held to a single story. She was afraid. She had no choice. He was a man who hit, who controlled, who had spent 50 years turning her into an instrument of his will just as surely as he turned drifters at bar counters into instruments. But there was one piece of evidence, one document, one thing that complicated that narrative in a way no one could ignore. The list. Faye Copeland had kept a written list of the hired hands who had passed through the farm. Next to each name was a mark, a cross or the letter X. Next to the names of the living, nothing. Next to the dead, a mark. When investigators found it, they stood in silence for a moment because it took a second to process what they were looking at. Was this the careful housekeeping of a woman who managed a working farm and wanted a record of who had worked when? Or was it something darker, some form of participation that went well past turning a blind eye? No one knew. Faye Copeland never explained it directly. She never explained it at all. James Handy was a man who got lucky, or had good instincts, or just enough of that animal sense for self-preservation that sometimes works where reason would hesitate. He came to the Copeland farm in the summer of 1989 with the same story as the others. Needed work, had nowhere to be. Copeland's offer sounded fine. He worked a few weeks. He saw things he didn't fully understand. He heard things he didn't want to. And then, without being able to put it into words, he picked up his belongings and left. He didn't go far. He went to the police. What Handy told investigators at the Davies County Sheriff's Office sounded improbable enough to demand verification. He described the check operation, the cattle transactions, the hired hands who arrived and didn't come back. He described the atmosphere on the farm, the particular quality of the silence there, the way Copeland looked at a man as if pricing him out. He said he was scared, even though he couldn't point to a single specific incident that would have justified it in a police report. Investigators started checking. They began with the paper trail. Bad checks, complaints from cattle sellers, the long record of legal violations that trailed behind Copeland's name across several decades. All verifiable, all true. Then they started asking about the hired hands, about the men who disappeared. And that's where things broke open, because the trail on each of those men ended at exactly the same address, the Copeland farm. A search warrant was drawn up on a cool October morning. The investigators arrived in force, multiple vehicles, because they already sensed this wasn't routine. Ray Copeland was sitting on the porch when they pulled in. His face, according to those who were there, showed no fear. It showed something harder to read. Anger, maybe, or calculation, or the expression of a man who knows the game is over but refuses to acknowledge it out loud. Faye stood at the kitchen window watching the driveway. No one remembered what her face showed. They started with the barn floor. The boards were old and some were loose, and when the first investigator pried one up and looked underneath, he understood immediately that this was going to be a very long day. Then the well. The remains of 5 men, in varying states of decomposition, some reduced to bone, others better preserved by the cool, damp air, were identified over the following weeks through fingerprints, dental records, and social security numbers. Each name came back to the living world only to be entered into a criminal case file and a coroner's report. Jack Wayne Freeman, Paul Jason Cowart, John Harold Freeman, Jimmy Dale Harvey, Wayne Robert Warner. 5 names, 5 deaths, 5 marks on a list kept in a kitchen drawer, filed between recipes and electric bills. Ray Copeland's interrogations ran for hours. He was consistent, controlled, and given the circumstances, remarkably calm. He denied, he explained, he reframed. He was a man who had spent 75 years perfecting the art of saying what he wanted to say instead of what was true. And that skill didn't fail him now, not even in a room with a one-way mirror and investigators who already knew what was in the well. He described the hired hands as workers who had come and gone. He described the transactions as misunderstandings. He described the checks as bookkeeping errors. When they asked him about specific names, Freeman, Cowart, Harvey, something crossed his face for half a second before it went still again. Stone, calculated, cold. In the end, he admitted to nothing. He didn't say why. He didn't say how. He didn't say whether he was sorry, because regret requires some awareness of harm done, and whatever awareness Ray Copeland may have once had was buried too deep, under too many layers of pragmatism and cold utility, to surface now. Psychiatrists who evaluated him before trial described him as a man with pronounced antisocial traits, ruthless, without empathy, motivated entirely by self-interest. One report noted that Ray Copeland viewed other people solely in terms of their usefulness. That's clinical language, but it's also an accurate description of everything this case reveals. The men at the bar counters were tools. Faye was a tool. The farm was a machine for extracting cash. And human life, in that accounting, was worth exactly as much as its immediate utility. Faye Copeland was interrogated separately. This is where the case becomes its most difficult. Not because it's ambiguous, but because it's too clear in the wrong places. Faye maintained she was a victim. She said Ray had beaten her for decades, controlled everything. What she ate, where she went, who she talked to. She said she had been too afraid to tell anyone because she knew what would happen if she tried. Witnesses backed parts of this up. Neighbors confirmed Copeland was a hard, domineering man. The couple's adult children described their father as harsh and controlling. There was no real question that Ray Copeland had been an abusive husband in the fullest sense of that term. But the list, that one detail that didn't fit the portrait of a woman paralyzed by fear. Keeping that record, systematically, carefully, marking off the dead, required more than passive knowledge. It required a decision. A small one, maybe one she didn't fully understand in its implications, but a decision. To write it down. To keep it. Not to burn it. Psychologists said different things. Some argued the list was an act of dissociation, a way of reducing an unbearable reality to data points. Others said that explanation didn't hold, that a woman who tracks murders is a participant. The defense argued Ray had told her to keep the list, that it was just another form of control, another way of implicating her so deeply she could never get out. The prosecution put the list in front of the jury and asked, does this look like the work of someone who was helpless? Does this look like passivity? There is no clean answer. The answer depends on what you're willing to believe about the outer limits of fear, about where victimhood ends and complicity begins, and whether that line is even a line at all, or just a place we draw because we need one. The trials ran through 1990 and 1991. Ray first, then Faye. The courthouse in Gallatin, a small county seat, filled every morning with locals, reporters from across the state. and that specific mix of revulsion and fascination that these cases produce in small communities. Revulsion because this happened here, to people they knew, in a place they recognized, and fascination because revulsion alone doesn't answer anything. Ray Copeland sat at the defense table and looked like a tired old farmer who didn't understand what he was doing there. 76 years old, frail, weathered. His attorney challenged the forensic evidence, questioned the chain of custody, pressed on every gap he could find. But the bodies were there. The rifle was there, with ballistics matching the wounds. And there were witnesses who had seen those hired hands on the farm and never seen them anywhere after. The jury didn't deliberate long. 5 murders, 5 death sentences. Ray Copeland became the oldest person sentenced to death in United States history. He was 76 when the judge read the verdict. That fact got repeated in every news story about the case because it's the kind of number that sticks, vivid, easy to pass along. But behind that number is something more troubling. That through all of it, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, Missouri, decades of fraud, 5 murders. Nobody stopped him. The system that was supposed to intervene showed up years too late. 5 men died because they were invisible. Faye Copeland went to trial in 1991 and received 5 consecutive life sentences, 1 for each murder. The court didn't sentence her to death, in part because the direct evidence of her role in the killings was weaker. No one saw her shoot anyone. No one saw her bury anything. In part because the jury was wrestling with the same question everyone wrestled with. Where does the victim end and the accomplice begin? Does that boundary even exist as a clear line? The verdict was severe, and it was also a compromise. The judgment of people who could say you were part of this, but not you designed it. Mooresville changed after the case, and it didn't change at all. That's what happens in small towns after something the press calls a sensation, and the neighbors live through like an earthquake. The Copeland house stood empty for a while, the driveway overgrown, a for sale sign that nobody called about. Eventually, someone bought the land, for other crops, a different future, and tore down the barn. The barn was torn down. There's a particular weight to that. The barn was where things ended, where the floor kept what couldn't be kept anywhere else. They tore it down so it would be gone, so it wouldn't stand on the landscape like a marker, a destination, a place people drove to with cameras. But the ground stays. Ground always stays. Nobody can say whether Earth can be cleaned of a history that happened inside it, or whether that's even a question worth asking. The neighbors said different things over the years. Some said they had no idea. Others said they knew something was off, but didn't know what to do with that. Those drifters weren't their people, those nameless men who came and went. A third group, smaller and harder to place, sat at kitchen tables with their coffee and said, "You know, something always bothered me about that place. Something told me not to get too close to the Copelands, but that's not enough to call the sheriff, is it? A feeling isn't a reason." It wasn't enough. And that's the part of this story that resists a clean ending. Not in the quiet Missouri countryside, not in a culture built on the understanding that you don't ask about your neighbor's business, that what happens behind closed doors stays there, that discretion is a form of respect. The men who vanished from the Copeland farm didn't vanish into a void. They vanished into a cultural agreement, unwritten but deeply held, that nobody asks too loudly, because loud questions are impolite. And being impolite makes everyone uncomfortable, and keeping the peace is its own kind of value. That peace cost 5 lives. Ray Copeland never made it to the execution chamber. In 1993, he suffered a stroke and was moved to the prison hospital. He died there. The precise date varies across sources, behind closed doors, without a word that explained anything. Faye outlived him. She served her time at the women's state prison, growing older, growing sick. In 1999, she had a stroke. Prisoner rights advocates filed for compassionate release. The petition worked its way through boards and legal challenges until 2002, when Faye Copeland, 83 years old, walked out of prison into the care of her son. She was placed in a nursing home and died in 2003. She gave no interviews. She published no memoir. She never said what no one ever learned. Exactly what she knew. Exactly what she felt. What was in her mind when she kept that list? When she saw men leave the barn and not come back? When she stood at the kitchen window and watched the investigators pull into the driveway? What she saw in that ground, which kept quiet the same way she did. Jack Wayne Freeman was 48 years old when he died. Paul Jason Cowart was 37. John Harold Freeman was 27. Jimmy Dale Harvey was 39. Wayne Robert Warner. His age is not recoverable from the records that survived. Those numbers, ages, names, are what's left of a person once the case files have finished with the circumstances and you try to get back to the individual. Who were they? Not in a forensic sense, but in any real human sense. What did they like to eat? What music did they know? What did they lie awake worrying about in shelters in Kansas City and Springfield when they stared at the ceiling and tried to figure out what came next? For each of them, what came next ended on a farm in Daviess County, Missouri. It ended without warning, because that was the whole architecture of the scheme, that no one would see it coming, that there would be no running. And then the body went into the ground, which kept quiet about it for years, with the same indifference that ground keeps quiet about everything. They had no marked graves, no services, no obituaries in the local paper. They existed only as entries in case files, as entries in forensic statistics, as proof that the kind of invisibility that attaches itself to homeless men and drifters, social, systemic, deeply cultural invisibility, can kill as efficiently as a bullet. When people talk about this case, the pull is always toward Copeland, toward his psychology, his method, the mechanics of a mind that could look at another human being and see only a function. That pull is understandable. Evil in its personal, concentrated form is always more compelling than the conditions that allow it to operate. But the conditions matter more. They tell us not just about Ray Copeland, but about ourselves. About a system that logged years of fraud, complaints without connecting them to the men who went missing. About a culture that accepted the disappearance of homeless men because homeless men just move on. About the long, quiet complicity of people who knew a little bit and did nothing, distributed so widely that there is no single person to blame. That's a harder thing to carry than the story of one killer. That weight belongs to everyone. The well was filled in. The barn was demolished. The house, the White House with the peeling paint, stood for a while and then disappeared too, replaced by something new or by ground that returned to growing grass or grain or nothing in particular. The earth in Missouri is hard and patient. It takes everything, seeds and bones, harvests and secrets, rain and drought, year after year, without comment, without judgment. It doesn't accuse and it doesn't forgive. It just persists. Maybe that's the one thing it can offer that the law and the courts cannot. That cold, earthly indifference. Neither comfort nor condemnation, just continuation. 5 men lay in that ground for years. Nobody searched for them. Nobody knew they were there. When the earth finally gave them back, through the hands of investigators, through a court order, through a long October day with shovels and flashlights, they entered the record as a case, as statistics, as evidence. This story doesn't have a clean moral. Evil was punished in the legal sense, and there's something real in that, something that lets you say justice was served and close the file. But the file doesn't close the question of those 5 men, or whether a system that overlooked them in life did enough for them in death. Whether putting their names in a court document is the same thing as acknowledging who they were. Whether you can undo a living neglect with a posthumous verdict. You can't, not entirely. In Mooresville, autumn came back. It always does. The leaves go yellow and fall. The ground hardens. The farmers finish with the corn. Dogs lie on porch boards and watch the fields in the afternoon light, patient and untroubled. The earth is quiet. It always was. That's all for tonight. But before you leave this darkness, take a moment. Every story you heard here really happened. Somewhere there are people who remember, who still can't sleep at night, who are still searching for answers. Crime is never just a story. It's someone's life. That went terribly wrong, or was taken by someone who thought they would get away with it. And sometimes they do. But silence has a way of speaking. Eventually. If this story made you feel something, leave a comment. Just one word. One sign that you were here, that you listened, that you remember. Because that's what silent crime stories is all about.